Hello, I'm John Perkins, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, third edition, China's Economic Hitman Strategy and Ways to Stop the Global Takeover. And so on this program, we're going to talk about how China and the United States are competing in a race that's really taking us to disaster, to a death economy, an economic system that no longer works. And how so much of the rest of the world, Africa, Latin America, and many other countries are looking to China to be the number one trading partner and investor. And in fact, China has already become the number one trading partner and investor in these countries because of a number of factors that we're going to talk about in this program. And as a third thing, we're really going to look at how we move beyond this. How does China and the United States join forces to come together to recognize that there's a common enemy, as though it was aliens coming down from outer space, that we are the aliens, our attitude that we are a part from rather than a part of nature has alienated us. So it's really time for these two countries to come together and insist and map out a plan to transform the death economy to a life economy. All that and the show yet to come. Thanks.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, he's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Now, recently, the AI platform ChatGPT took the world by surprise. Now, it's fascinating because we've all known AI was coming, yet somehow we were still shocked. Now, take a moment and consider what else that might be sort of looming on the horizon that we've had all the warning signs for, but we just ignore it. And then I think about at what cost. Well, that's the curious and intriguing road we're going down in the next two episodes as we examine the third wave of the Economic Hitman Strategy. As always, we need your help in staying relevant, so please get over to wherever it is that you tune into the show from. Do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps us. We sincerely appreciate it when you do that. Hit those buttons, or as they say, smash those buttons. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's just dive right in. Remember when the U.S. ruled the world, or at least economically? Now, you might be ready to push back and go, well, we still do. Are you sure about that? Is the U.S. still the #1 investor? Is the U.S. still the #1 trading partner across the world? Well, if you said yes, you're in for a shock. Who is it and what does it mean for the rest of the world is where we're going on the next two episodes with our special guest, returning champion, Mr. John Perkins, a.k.a. the Economic Hitman. John Perkins says that we are at the beginning of the third wave of the Economic Hitman Strategy rolling out across the world. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the work of a man with an intimate insider pass as well as the highest possible credentials. John Perkins is an economist, an author, and an activist. As chief economist for a major consulting firm, John was an advisor to the World Bank, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, Fortune 500 corporations, leaders of countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and the U.S. government agencies. His 11 books, including Confessions of an Economic Hitman, Touching the Jaguar, and Shapeshifting, spent 70, no less, 70 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. They're all published in more than 35 languages and have sold over 2 million copies. His latest book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the third edition, describes China and China's use of the economic hitman strategy and the need to transform the failing, degenerative death economy that we've moved into and move into a regenerative life economy. John has lectured at more than 50 universities, been featured on ABC, NBC, CNN, Time, New York Times, Elle, Der Spiegel, and many others. He's gone on to become a founder of the nonprofit Dream Change and Pashmana Alliance. His latest book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman-Part 3, or edition, third edition, is described as, in there he describes his unforgivable acts that he committed as the chief economist at these major consulting firm, and the crimes executed by the CIA assets known as jackals who stood behind him. Fascinating stuff to get into. He's gone on to expose the economic hitman strategy that is taken on a new look and is being used in ominous proportions after China has entered the fray back in the early 2000s. He then offers a plan for us to convert the resulting failing, as I said, the degenerative death economy into a really regenerative life economy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help us welcome returning champion, Mr. John Perkins. Good to have you here, mate.
It's good to be here, Dov. I much appreciate it. It was quite an introduction. I think I can go away now.
Yeah, it's all over now, mate. Nothing else for you to do.
You've said it all. What more is it?
So this is the third version of the Economic Hitman book. So can we sort of bring everybody up to speed? Because, of course, some of the people who are listening are going to be big fans of your work because it's been enormously popular. But if you can bring people up to speed, walk us quickly through the first, second, and third way the economic hitman strategy works. Because you know, in our conversations, you've talked about this evolving. So give us a here's what it looks in 1, 2, and now the third one.
Sure. So the first wave was the wave I was in. It started in the 1970s and continued. And basically it was relatively few people like me who, in my staff, and we identified countries that had resources our corporations want, like oil or copper or gold or today lithium. And then we'd arrange huge loans to those countries from the World Bank or its sister organizations. But the money would be used to hire our own companies to build big infrastructure projects in those countries, power plants, industrial parks, highways, ports, those sorts of things. So our own companies would make big profits off these projects. And a few wealthy families in the countries would gain because they own the industries that benefited from infrastructure. But the country...
So on the news, it would look like this country just got X billions of dollars. This is going to be great for our country. It's got a great propaganda to it. But the average person would never see any, not even the money, but any benefits of it.
That's quite, yes. And in fact, the opposite. Money would be diverted from education, healthcare, and other social services to pay the interest on the loans. And in the end, the country, usually couldn't pay the principal.
No, they would default.
Yeah. And the collateral was oil or lithium these days or whatever the mineral is. And we'd go in and demand that we get the collateral, that our companies be able to take out the oil or the minerals at very, very low prices with very few, if any, environmental and social regulations. But it looked good because statistically you could show that when all these things happened, the economy of the country grew. GDP grew because GDP is a measure of how well the wealthy are doing, corporations. It doesn't really measure the average people. As an example, Dov, in the United States, 3 individuals have as much wealth as half the population of the United States.
Yeah.
If those 3 individuals are doing well, even if half the population is doing very poorly, it'll still look like the GDP is doing well. So these statistics are very skewed in favor of the rich, but it looks good. You go in and say, hey, you want your country to prosper, take these big loans, hire companies to build infrastructure, and your country will prosper. That was the first wave.
Right. And that's what you were part of, going in, working out where the things were and who needed the money.
Right.
And then setting that up.
Exactly.
Right.
And, and as I pointed out, my job was pretty easy because behind me were people we called jackals, who the presidents of country knew that if they didn't buy into this deal, then something strange might happen to them. And, the United States has a long history of getting involved in coups and even assassinations of people like Allende of Chile and Mossadegh of Iran and Arbenz of Guatemala and Lumumba of the Congo and Diem of Vietnam and Zelaya of Honduras, on and on and on. So
I want to pause there for a sec, because I want people to grasp that, because it sounds like a throwaway line, and I just want to make sure it isn't. Yeah. Because you can be patriotic. I know you're patriotic, John. We've talked about this before. You can be patriotic for your country. That doesn't mean you can't question your country. In fact, to be patriotic, you must question your country, I would argue. And, you having this inside track. So this is not a guy just throwing out conspiracy theories. Inside track knows about these jackals who were hired to kill people, who were hired to dethrone governments and change governments for corporate interests. And this was done, but, we go, those Russians, if you disagree with the government, you commit suicide out of a hospital window that doesn't open, whatever it is. This is not a Russia thing. This is something the U.S. has a long history of, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Right.
It's true.
Okay.
And we're like good mafiosos, we're very clever at it. Often, for example, we know that presidents in Ecuador and Panama, what happened to them was probably done by the junta in Argentina, basically under the control of the CIA. So that was during Operation Condor. So actually, the States wasn't directly involved, except to have planted the idea and
financed it.
And the junta owed the CIA favor. So, so there's this long kind of history. And incidentally, Allende, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has talked about our role in overthrowing Allende of Chile and replacing him with Pinochet, who was a terrible dictator, and then was at our beck and call in many ways. Yeah, it's an unfortunate situation, but it did make my job easy, because here I go in, I hold out the carrot, I say, hey, you guys, you and your family who own the industries, you take sign it out on this loan, and you're going to do really, really well. Or if you don't, well, on this end, I got a carrot here and I got a stick here. I got a gun. I never carried a gun, but they knew, as I did, that guys with guns were right behind me, or guys who had access to other guys with guns. Anyway, that was the first wave.
Right.
It was so successful that the second wave, which I write about in the second of this trilogy on Economic Hitmen, came about because the first was so successful that then the decision was made, well, let's spread this not just to the lower income countries, but let's spread it to the upper income countries, the European countries and the United States. And so this whole debt thing then began to spread to include things like student debt and healthcare debt and credit card debt. And, this huge idea that make people dependent on the system, and they really can't object to the system. They can't get out of the system. And so we had a whole series of people who represented corporations. So in my day, we were sort of generic. We went in, we wanted to get jobs for American companies. We wanted profits. We wanted to get oil and the resources. We didn't really care whether Bechtel got the contract or Brown and Root got the contract or Stoner West. As long as one of them got the contract, and we get a part of the deal. Then the second wave was corporate economic hitmen. So essentially, after that, and including today, every major corporation has its own economic hitman, an equivalent to that. and they'll pit countries and cities against each other.
The way that Amazon went after what city should we go into, and it was all about, there were cities fighting to have Amazon in.
Classic
with
case.
the idea it's going to create jobs, right? That was the idea. That's what was sold.
Well,
that was bullshit.
Yeah, well, no, it was a hit. But go to New York and go to Atlanta, Georgia, and say, well, if you cut your taxes, if you don't make us pay taxes, if you don't make us, adhere to certain environmental or social regulations, we'll go to your city. And it was interesting. In the case of Amazon, New York won. Amazon chose New York. But then the New Yorkers began to see what was really happening here. They were going to lose their tax money and so forth, and turned it down. But
wow.
And that happened in the United States, and it happens big time overseas. So, a company's going to build a big manufacturing facility for shoes or whatever, and they go to Indonesia, and they go to the Philippines, and they go to Thailand, and they say, hey, who's going to give us the best deal? And usually that best deal screws the people of the country.
Right.
They don't get good wages, they don't get health care, whatever it is. So these deals are struck. So this was the second wave, economic hitmen that represent big corporations on many, many levels. And the first wave continued, and it does continue. So both of these are still going on.
Oh, so they're layering.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got government, then you've got corporate, but on top of each other.
Right.
And each time that happens, the lower sort of working class and even middle class are getting squashed.
Right. And in my day, it was primarily the lower middle classes of lower income countries.
Right.
That it became all of us, basically.
Right.
And now the third wave is China.
Mm-hmm.
And, China had tremendous success at home of growing its economy, roughly
3 decades in a row.
3 decades in a row, about 10% a year, brought 700 million people out of dire poverty. Nobody else has ever done anything like that.
Yeah, and we should pause to let people, sort of take that in. That's a pretty amazing achievement to bring that many millions of people out of poverty in such a short period of time. I mean, the nouveau riche of China is insane. And that's applaudable, but with a consequence, right?
Yeah. I mean, so China's, have these couple of things. They've grown a tremendous number of billionaires. There's an amazing inequality. And yet at the same time, they've brought more than 700 million people out of dire poverty. The rest of the world combined hasn't done even that.
Wow.
So it's a success story. And yet, I was teaching at an MBA program in China not long ago, and the Chinese students would tell me, we did this economic miracle, but it's come at a horrible price socially and environmentally. We've had to live with terrible pollution, but we're not going to do that in the future. That young Chinese are highly motivated not to have pollution in the future because they've experienced it. That's another story. Anyway, this third wave really took a hold. So China had this internal development. Its economy had grown incredibly. And Xi Jinping takes power in 2012, 2013, that period. And he decides, well, let's take this out to the world. And that's, I was invited to speak at the MBA program. And basically, these young Chinese who've been earmarked to be the leaders of China in the future, they wanted to learn how I'd done it. Learn how to be a successful economic hitman. Also learn the mistakes, the failures that we had. And it was very interesting. And so since that time, since 2012, 2013, up until now, China has worked very hard to basically take over the world. And it's been very successful. Now it's the number one investor in most every country in Africa and Latin America. Its investments in lower income countries is more than the rest of the world combined, including the United States. And so it's really it's just amazing how successful China's been. People will say, well, I'm afraid China's going to take over. Well, China has taken over. There's just no question about it. That doesn't mean it's going to continue to do that. And I want to get into that in more detail later. But
Sure.
it has become the number one investment and trading partner all over the world, more than the United States. And it's also invested tremendously, which is not known to most people, in low carbon investment. It's invested 4 times. Last year, 2022, it invested more than 4 times what the United States did. China's total investment in low carbon is more than half the global total and 4 times that of the United States. And other countries look at this, Dove, and say, well, you know, we might rather be like China than the United States.
Right.
They seem to be doing a lot to grow their economy, to get rid of poverty. And at the same time, they're working hard to get rid of pollution. And the other side of it is they don't have the history we have of jackals and of doing some of the dirty tricks that we do, which doesn't mean they won't do them. But you go to Latin America, you go to Africa, and leaders will say, well, yeah, but they don't have that history. And so their economic hitmen have stepped in and been incredibly successful. However, the point I want to make in this new book primarily is that these 2 countries, which control almost half of the world's economy and almost half of the world's pollution, they are involved in a race, a competition to be the most powerful nation on the planet.
The U.S. and China.
Yeah. And this race is a race to disaster. In the process, this economic hitman system has created what we can call a death economy, an economic system that's consuming and polluting itself into extinction, that's depleting in the short term the very resources it needs for the long term. And we know that, it's the cause, this death economy is the cause of climate change, income inequality, species extinction. Those are all problems, but they're not the problem. The problem is this death economy. And here are these 2 incredibly powerful countries competing to be the number one proponent of the death economy. And that is what we need to turn around and create something we could call a life economy, which is an economic system that pays people to clean up all the pollution, to mine the plastic in the oceans and do many other things to clean up pollution, to regenerate destroyed environments, to recycle, and to create new technologies in energy that don't require fossil fuels, and many new things. And we're in the process of doing that, Dove. I think we're on the way to it, but we've got to move a little faster.
Well, that's what I was going to say, John, because it's pretty easy to sort of throw your hands up in the air and go, we don't stand a chance. I mean, I hear people saying this, and having Greta scream at us, I don't know that works either, right? So, it feels a little overwhelming for a lot of people. And at the same time, I've said for years that I think that the greatest addiction of human beings is comfort, right? So, I say to people all the time, do you ever buy anything from Amazon? They go, yeah. And I go, why? Because they ain't cheaper. So why? And they go, well, it's just so convenient. Exactly. It's so convenient. It's delivered to your door. And if you don't like it, you can ship it back. It's convenient. It's not necessarily cheaper, but you can look on your phone and you can have it with you, depending on where you are, sometimes within the day. So, it's this, I don't know. I can't see how we're giving up that. And then they're sending me shit in a box that's this big, by this, that's got a little thing in it inside with plastic bubble in it. And I'm like, yeah. So I think that a lot of the times, you've got on the left, just people screaming about the planet and all those kinds of things. And on the right, you've got people who are maybe got a bit more money and a bit more wealth who are not willing to give up their comforts. So if we're going to go from a death economy to a live and invigorated economy, do we have to give up our comforts?
I don't think we have to give up comfort. We may have to give up excessive things that some of us think of may be comfort,
right.
that we really don't need. I've gone from living in a pretty big house to living in a very small townhouse, and I'm much more comfortable here, frankly. There's not as many things to worry about and fix and get cleaned,
Right.
And I think, there's the way we define comfort is interesting. It's a perception that we have of more materialism. That bumper sticker that says, "He who dies with the most toys," or "She who dies with the most toys dies happiest." That's ridiculous.
Of course it is.
Yeah, and it's destroying the planet. So what we and on the other side of the coin, people say we have to stop growth. No more growth. That's absurd too. If you're starving in Africa or India or in major U.S. cities, Canadian cities too, you want growth. We need growth in solar and wind power. We need growth in new technologies that don't ravage the earth. We need growth in ways to bring food to malnourished and starving people. We need growth in ideas. There's so many areas that we can grow in, and people can prosper from that and make a living at doing it. That's what the life economy is. And we've seen it happening with things like the Green New Deal and conscious capitalism and benefit corporations and B corporations, and the tremendous growth in solar and wind energy that's happened very, very recently. In fact, it wasn't so long ago that people said, "There's no way solar and wind are never going to compete with fossil fuels." Well, they do now on every level.
Well, you and I are old enough to remember Jimmy Carter putting solar panels on the White House, solar panels on the roof, and Ronnie taking them down.
Yeah, first day in the White House, Ronald Reagan takes them down.
Takes them down. Like, why don't you just leave them? They're not doing anything. You can even switch them off if you want, but
it was a statement.
It was a statement, of course. But let's talk about the other side of this, because I think there's a piece that I need to push back on, not for me, but for the audience, which is because we've seen it, greenwashing. I mean, there's so much greenwashing. There's so much stuff that looks like it's supposed to be good for the planet and actually isn't. I recycle, I sort all the shit out into the different bins, and we know that 5% of everything I sort out is getting recycled, and the rest is like, we can't do that. It's too much, right? So we're not bothering with it. So the recycling's nonsense. We want to drive electric cars and everything's rechargeable, so we're not using batteries from the store, but we've got these batteries, and we're needing lithium, and we're needing cobalt, we're needing these things. And there's child slave labor happening in Africa, with kids who are 5 years old and people who are working for, in slave labor. That's going on too, to build batteries that are going in cars that are non-recyclable, to go in vehicles that are plugging into an old system that in most parts of the world is running on fossil fuels. So it's like, yeah, come on. Is it really working? Are we really doing it? The wind turbines, love the idea, but it's true that it's killing a lot of birds. Now, are there better ones and new ones? There are. There's some fantastic ones that don't have the big blades on them, and they're great. But there's all this, it looks green, but it's really not, side of things that I want to push back on, because I want to say, I want a clean economy. I just don't want an economy that's looking clean, because otherwise I look like, I don't know, like an economic hitman going in and saying, here's a loan, it's going to be really good for you guys, but not really. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It kind of feels like that.
Yeah. Well, and some of it is, but things happen incrementally, and we need to recognize that. You mentioned wind turbines. I spent a lot of time in the Amazon, and those wind turbines use trees from the Amazon, balsa trees, which are very light wood. So the blades, they look like they're made out of metal. They're not. They're made out of balsa
wood.
Then they're covered with metal. They're coated with metal. And it's been devastating to parts of the Amazon. But now some of the indigenous people are understanding that they can start, balsa trees grow pretty quickly. And they can start these businesses of growing balsa trees. So, and that'll help the situation. I think I have to believe, because I don't want to believe the alternative, I have to believe that we are moving forward in this direction, and I do believe we're moving forward, that there's a consciousness revolution. People are waking up to the fact that it just plain isn't working this way. And everywhere that's happening. I travel a lot. I took a little break during the pandemic and did it virtually, but now I'm back to doing it. I'm speaking at 4 different events in Europe this year. I just came back from Latin America and the Bahamas and speaking at all these things. And everywhere I go, I see that people are waking up to the fact that we must change. And Dov, I think it's important that the pandemic taught us that we can change. Have to, and we can even enjoy the change. We can learn from the change. We can we can read a book we've always wanted to read, or write a book we always wanted to write. People have done amazing things during the pandemic that they never would have done otherwise, and we can change. And we've seen, from a social standpoint in the United States and in Canada and many other places, a huge change in attitudes towards same-sex marriage and transgender issues. That's happened, in the snap of a finger in human history time. So we're capable of this. And what's required now is this change of consciousness to move from the goal, which is the goal of the death economy, is to maximize short-term profits and materialistic consumption, maximize those things. And the goal of the life economy is to maximize long-term benefits for people and nature. So once we change that consciousness, the perception of what it means to be successful, then we are in a position to change the actions that then change the reality, and we move from a death to a life economy. It's a process, but we're in the process now. The process has begun.
Well, I definitely think there's a shift in consciousness. And I agree that things are incremental. Does it get better, or I don't know I don't know how long it takes. But as you and I talked about many years ago, I'm trying to remember it was a physicist who said that sometimes for things to change, you have to wait for the old guard to die. Yeah. And yes, there is a rise in this understanding that we need to do things differently. And again, looking at China, and that's where I want to go in part 2 of the show, because looking at China, who pulled 700 million people out of abject poverty, who look like a country that's doing very, very well, there's a side of people who are going, yeah, that's what we want. There's also a side of people who are going, oh my God, that's not what we want, because that's definitely not a democracy, not even close to a democracy. And you've got a social, a system of, are you behaving well and you can't go on a train, or, pretty scary stuff. But
yeah,
I really wonder what it will take for us. And when I say us, I mean the average person, or the person who's running a business and saying, yeah, but this is my business. I'm not throwing away. What will it take for us to take the steps? And how can we deal with this threat that you talked about with China? I want to talk about all that in part 2, specifically about the threat with China, because that's what the book is about. And what we can do to pay attention so we don't go down that road. Okay, John, it's always a joy and a pleasure, sir. We're going to come back for part 2 of the show in just a click. But before we do, please tell people where they can find out more about you, your books, and all the other things you're involved in. And there's a lot.
Thank you. The easiest thing is just to go to johnperkins.org. And you can, order the books there, and you can order from your local bookstore. Or you can order from my local bookstore, which is here in near Seattle, a family-owned local bookstore. And if you order through that bookstore, and all the information's on my website, I'll go in and sign the book for you, and the bookstore will send it to you, or whoever you want to send it to, your friends and neighbors. You can order 100 of them there, and I'll sign 100 of them for you and your friends and neighbors. But anyway, go to johnperkins.org. All the information is there in whatever form. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And of course, we will make sure that all that information is put into the show notes of how you can reach out to John. You can find out about all of his different books. As I said, there's a lot of different books and a lot of different things he's involved in. Till then, till we come back in just one click, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about your participation in a death economy and what it would take for you as an individual, for you as an organization to become part of a regenerative economy. We'll be back in just one click. See you soon. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.